Welcome back, everybody. All right, in this time we're going to be discussing Karl Marx's Laws of Motion from his work Das Kapital, volumes 1 through 3. This is the fourth part in a series of lectures hitting some of the critical points of Karl Marx's Das Kapital. As I mentioned in this video, we're going to be talking about the laws of motion, and those include, so we need to build upon what we've covered in the last several lectures, several bullet points here, right? So first of all, market prices, there's a typo there. Market prices are a function of labor inputs, but not directly tied to labor inputs. Okay, so Marx is still employing a labor theory of value, but one that's modified from, say, David Ricardo's labor theory of economics, or labor theory of value, excuse me, or indeed from sort of conventional explanations of labor theory of value, namely, like, if a thing takes 4 hours, it costs X, and if it takes 8 hours to make, it costs 2X. This is not what Marx is doing. The variables you see there are directly related to the model presented in the second of these video lectures. I'll put the link below in the description, and then also covered in the third part. So this is just the expression for prices, the first one, and the expression for value in normal Marxian terminology. The relationship between prices and values, so the relationship between those two items, depends upon the organic composition of capital, or the variable Q. If an industry's Q was greater than the mean level of Q, right? So if we have the organic composition of capital across all industries, right? A firm that has a Q value that's greater than the mean value is going to see a market price for its goods that's greater than the embedded value, and the reverse is also true. So in this way, the firms with above average organic compositions of capital are effectively able to capture surplus value from firms with a lower Q value. Again, this is all from the third lecture. Okay, we also learned in the first and second videos that sort of the Marxist structure assumes philosophically that all valuable is attributable to labor, right? So anything of value is valuable because labor is embedded within it, or labor made it. Okay, and that idea goes back a long way. Maybe one of these days I'll do a video on John Locke and all that stuff, but it goes back, it's essentially Enlightenment era sort of reasoning. Of course, as we saw in the first lecture, market prices do not reflect labor inputs, and we talked about that a moment ago. Surplus values are the differences between the value that labor produces and what it's paid in money terms. So if labor is producing $40 worth of value and they're getting paid $20, then surplus value is 20, okay? And profit is derived from surplus values. Okay, so from all of that and everything we've seen in the first three videos, Marx has a sort of dynamics that's implied from his model, and these are referred to as the laws of motion, and there are several of these. We have 7 here, and I've actually combined a couple of them from the original here. First law of motion is an investment of capital occurs only when profits can be earned. Okay, so the rationale for inserting capital into the machinery of the economy, the second video, is to earn a profit. So that's why you invest, right? And then that implies a negative correlation between surplus value and, of course, wages and investment. So in this way, we can really see the Ricardian roots of Marx's model. If wages come up, then surplus values go down, all things being equal. And of course, if surplus values go down, then profits also go down. And then the rationale for investment goes down, economic growth slows, and then unemployment increases, right? Okay, wages go back down, and so on. So very similar to the Ricardian Korn model in terms of investment, profit, wages, growth, and the relationships of those. Okay, so first law of motion. So the second of these laws of motion is the idea that owners of capital will always attempt to develop and incorporate new technology into production. And the simple reason for that, well, it's not really a simple reason, but the reason for that is because, of course, if they can do that, if they can gain a productivity advantage over other firms, then they can potentially earn more. Well, potentially, then they'll earn more surplus value for labor, and of course, earn more profits. So this is actually something that I think is underappreciated in Marx. Is that Marx saw capitalism as really an engine of technological development and of economic growth, as a tremendous vehicle of economic growth. I mean, the short version of this story of this sort of second law of motion is firms want to develop and incorporate new technology so that they can essentially get more productivity out of their workers and therefore capture more profit and surplus value from labor. So they do. The third law of motion, that is, since surplus value can be increased by using technology to increase productivity, right? You can also get the same effect by just working your workers harder, right? So forcing them to work longer hours, to be more intense while they're at work, essentially to keep their output maximized at all times. In this way, you can also extract more surplus value from them than you would do otherwise. Okay, the fourth of these laws of motion is that all things equal, larger firms will earn a greater amount of profit, not a greater rate of profit, but a greater amount of profit. And they will be able to receive a larger share of the total surplus value when compared to smaller firms. So since firms are earning profit on a share of capital, so the total capital invested in the economy is 500 and they're investing, 100, then they get a fifth of essentially of the profits. Another firm that's only investing half as much would only get half as much. Okay, so there's a rationale to be a large firm versus a small firm, in addition to the Q value that we already mentioned. Okay, fifth, and this is important, the rate of profit, which is defined in the Marxian scheme as S over C plus V, or surplus value S over C plus V, the payments to constant capital C and the payments to variable capital V, or if you remember, the constant capital is essentially the payments to machinery to keep it going, and V is the wage payment. So that rate, the rate of S over C plus V, will decline, all things being equal. And the simple reason for that is that as firms incorporate additional technology and machinery into the production process, there's less to exploit. In other words, C starts rising, all things being equal, in that equation there. Or C continues to rise, might be a better way of expressing it, causing that rate of profit to fall. If you think of it this way, like, the Marxian story goes like this. You have a business, right, and you have to, keep the machines going that help your workers, right, like the cash registers and the, the electric door and everything like that. And then you have to pay your workers, right, and you keep bringing in new technology. Well, whatever the maintenance payment is in the technology is what it is. You can't negotiate it downwards. But you can negotiate your wages downwards, and that's where you're going to get your surplus value. Well, as wages become a smaller and smaller share of your total cost outlay, there is less and less to exploit, and as a consequence, all things be equal, the rate of profit falls in the Marxian scheme. Okay, fifth law of motion. Sixth, the desire to maintain profits in the face of what I just mentioned, right, will lead to increased social conflict. So in other words, increasing conflict between workers and owners. Workers are trying to reduce the amount that they work to reduce work intensity. Owners are trying to crank it up. Small firms are attempting to hang on to the meager profits they have, but are constantly being sort of outgunned, as it were, by larger firms. And so as those smaller firms fail and larger firms get larger and larger, of course, the former owners of those small firms become workers and become part of this sort of mass struggling against a more intense pace of work. Okay. All this leads to 7. Okay. Now there's a lot of little things here, so I sort of made it its own subset of bullet points. Okay. The second one there, the increasing administration of labor, right? So in other words, the work pace is continually picking up as owners are trying to extract surplus value from a smaller and smaller share of the sort of total cost structure, labor, right? And that's because there's ever decreasing pool of surplus value that they're able to draw from, because surplus value can only be drawn to labor from labor, and labor is becoming less and less important part of the production process. Leads to a couple things. The first thing is that you get, the argument goes that you get workers who are increasingly alienated from the fruits of their production. So, we see, back to commodities in part 1. We see exchanges occurring between people and commodities rather than between people and people. People don't see the labor embedded in their work, or embedded in the commodities. They only see the commodity themselves. And in the next video we'll kind of go off on that a little bit and talk about that in some more depth. But suffice to say, we got the ball rolling on that. But the other thing that's happening is that of course there's this bigger and bigger pool of labor as a share of society, right? More and more people are becoming laborers as these small firms sort of get ground under this machinery. Is that workers become increasingly socialized in the sense that they learn how to work together and cooperate with each other rather than compete with each other inside of the workplace. So inside of the firm, right, not between the firm, right, but inside of the firm, workers are becoming more cooperative, more socialized, learning to work with each other just by accident because of the increasing scale of production, increasing scale of the firm. So all this sort of leads to this crisis where there becomes a point where essentially the rate of profit has declined to the point where at the same time where there's very little surplus value to extract from workers, right? So you can't get the rate of profit back up where it needs to be to continue to invest sufficiently. And what happens is that society decides to change the process. And particularly what Marx says they'll do is they become socialized, and so what they'll do is they will socialize the investment process, they'll socialize the production process. So essentially eliminate the owners in this case and run production for themselves based on some kind of democratic principle or something like this. Now, if this all seems like it's a little bit of a loose end here at the end about the socialization of the production process, that's perhaps not surprising because of the multiple thousands of pages devoted, thousands of pages in Das Kapital. Only about 50 of those are devoted to socialism. Okay, the book's name is Das Kapital, and the book is about capitalism, right? So it's all about everything we learned in the first 3 videos, and then these laws of motion that eventually leads to its demise, right? And then socialism is essentially the same sort of thing, except for rather than having owners of capital, you have workers simply controlling the workplace. So, what would this sort of look like in practice? Well, a lot of Marxian commentators make different things, and of course critics point to like the Soviet Union and stuff as what it would look like. But sympathetic critics like to point to things like worker-owned cooperatives, right? So where the workers own the machinery, the building, and everything else. And the idea is to have the workers decide, what's going to be produced, how it's going to be produced, and so on and so forth. What the nature of the production process will look like. Now, interestingly, it's worth noting that the idea of exploitation doesn't end when you get to socialism, right? So labor is the sort of nature of labor is to be exploited in Marx, and all that happens is that laborers become their own exploiters rather than being exploited by others. So that's sort of the story right there. We're going to come back we'll make one more video about Marx where we'll kind of summarize a lot of these points, but I want to make this not too long, and so I think we'll end it there. Okay, thanks much. See you next time, everybody.